Hi, everybody. Welcome again to my series about what we talk about when we talk about architecture. It's been a little crazy around the world lately. Architecture has definitely not been a consideration in a lot of what's going on, and we're seeing what happens sometimes when you don't properly look at future situations, how things can evolve, and you don't architect point solutions to issues and anticipate problems. So, without going a lot into the specifics, today I just want to give you some more architecture skills, get you thinking about big picture. I mean, if you apply it to our current times, being able to think big picture, being able to plan, being able to architect and anticipate situations and anticipate faults is going to help us and help you recover from these situations. Also, identifying where capabilities are changing, where capabilities are evolving, and where opportunities are opening up. Those are all parts of good architecture. Today, I just want to do three little things. I'm going to try to keep it short, as always. I want to talk to you about patterns and archetypes. I want to go into what's missing from my architecture diagram, which is governance. Architecture is not governance, and I think this is a really important distinction to talk about. And then finally, in application of the current times, I want to tell you a little story about that I had about being an epidemiologist and controlling a disease outbreak, and maybe there's some learnings from that. So, with no further ado, let's start and talk about patterns. I do have my Twitch stream open, by the way. So if you're here and you want to chat, I can jump over to here. My timing's gonna be a little off because, broadcast things are, do things one window, do things another window. But I'm doing the best I can here. So as you see, I've focused on my large mind map we've looked at, what we talk about when we talk about architecture. I focused on the upper right corner today on pattern languages. Architectures follow common languages. They follow common rules, common ways of looking at things. When we have buildings with columns, columns are a pattern. Doorways are patterns. There's different types of patterns made from doorways when we talk about physical building architecture. We see the same thing in software development, where we see repeated patterns around constructors or chain of responsibility pattern, or event-driven architectures, or data streaming. All of those are patterns. There's also a higher level abstraction that we don't see as much in software. We focus so much on patterns because software and technology is so much of an implementation art. We don't talk enough about the higher level abstractions from which those implementations come. Even the patterns themselves, patterns can be implemented and replicated, and you see pattern catalogs like the Gang of Four, which has code. The Gang of Four is an old book on object-oriented software design patterns, and it has code. Another book, right now we have functional programming patterns in Scala and Clojure. And this takes some of the existing patterns that we have, and for example, we have a replacing strategy pattern that's trying to replace object-oriented patterns with functional patterns. These come with code, they come with examples. You can take this and apply these patterns to your system where you see that there's a strategy that needs to be replaced with an object orientation, for example. But even having that and having those pattern catalogs, that's like your part catalog. And it's great when you know what you're looking for. It's great when you know what you're looking at. But when you don't have the framework, you don't really know where to go. It's kind of like if you didn't really know how cars worked, but you went in to get a fan belt. Great. You might just need to fix that fan belt and you replace that fan belt and it works. But if, let's say, you fix the fan belt and another part of the car doesn't start, do you have that level of higher level knowledge to be able to understand the bigger picture and what's happening there? So with that in mind, one of the things we talk about with architectures is archetypes. And archetypes are, they're more of the models and the shared concepts that we all have that we don't need to tell. I don't need to tell you to look up, the chain of responsibility. When I talk about three-tier system. Three-tier system, for example, is an archetype. It may mean different things to you than it means to me. Like for me, it may mean Java middleware database. For you, it might mean React and Node and Mongo, for example. But it's that shared idea of a three-tier system, that is an archetype. And then we have patterns within different types of patterns to implement that. We have, another archetype is a payment system. Payment systems, again, mean different things to different people. It might be the implementation of an e-commerce platform. It might be Square. Each of those are payment systems. They're different patterns, and they solve different problems, but they follow that archetype of payment systems. And I think, let me show you an example of something I've come across for archetypes. one thing I've learned recently is most scientists have always had esoteric backgrounds, so I'm no longer ashamed of some of the esoteric things that I'm interested in. Kepler, one of the greatest astronomers of all time, was a profound believer in astrology. So we can't discount all of that knowledge and can't compartmentalize it, and I don't have to anymore. I believe in the tarot cards. It's a great way to tell stories. And I came across a deck called the Wild Unknown deck, made by a woman who used to be here in Portland. Her name is Kim Kranz. Kim, thank you so much. She's made 3 decks that I'm aware of: the Wild Unknown, the Animal Spirit, and then the Wild Unknown Archetypes. They're round. The idea of the archetypes, again, is that rather than talking about specific things or specific traits, you're looking at general concepts of shared knowledge. Everybody thinks of these differently. Like with the archetypes, you shouldn't have to look it up in a book to see what that is. If somebody were to ask me, to look up a 3-tier system, that's something as somebody in engineering I should just know. If somebody were to ask me to look up web page, that's something that is there. If somebody were to ask me to look up script, a script is an archetype. They're implemented in different languages and different ways to doing it. Similarly, we look in here, the mentor. Isn't that an interesting one for me to bring up, considering my love of mentorship? The mentor is an archetype. That's just, different people do mentoring in different ways. Sometimes there's virtual mentoring. That's a pattern. Sometimes it's small group mentoring. Sometimes it's one-on-one mentoring. Sometimes it's a sustained relationship. Sometimes it's a one-shot deal. But there's the general archetype of the mentor as somebody who watches, somebody who helps you develop and leads the way for you. Similarly, we have the shaman. Gosh, I'm pulling interesting archetypes today. And the shaman is the same thing. Somebody who brings magic into something. The shaman could be, it could be a tribal leader. It could be a witch. It really depends. Your who you understand to be a shaman. A shaman could be Timothy Leary. Who you understand to be a shaman is dependent on your specific cultural experience, but the archetype of shaman is shared. Similarly, when we talk about shared culture, we talk about getting back into into architecture. Again, when we talk about an archetype, that's something that each of us might have an individual relationship to, and then those are our patterns or our instances of that, or our interpretations of the archetype. So that's the story of archetypes and pattern languages. I'll get into much more detail of that as we go forward. I want to cut this short. Don't want to go more than about 10 minutes. So let me throw out the other 2 parts I talked about. I'm going to do those real quick. When you look at my large roadmap here, I'm going to take us out of focus mode and bring the down. It takes a couple seconds here. There's a lot on here. We're talking about different languages, different approaches to architecture, what makes good and bad architecture. But what's interesting when you talk about architects and interviewing architects, so many people lead with governance, that architecture is governance. Architecture is the art. Architecture in the minds of governance architects is the way to enforce rules. That's not architecture. That's governance. Governance is a very different thing than architecture. Governance is a way to put architecture in place. In my opinion, it's not an effective one if it's done as a top-down, which is so often what we see, and that's why we have ivory tower architectures. Remember, I pulled the mentor and the shaman, and architecture is not alchemy, but we'll be talking about that. Architecture develops when you help people see the patterns, when you get your hands on with them at the archetypes. Architecture is something that is structured and shared and developed in concert with others. It is not something that is governed or mandated. It is something that is shared. And I think that's a critical approach. So often I've been talking to organizations lately that are looking for architects, and they're like, we don't want an ivory tower architect. We want somebody with their hands on. And to me, it's like, how can you be an architect if you don't put your hands in the system? How can you be an architect of software if you're not writing code? They go together. Yes, there is this governance. There's this element of spreading it through the organization. I don't think the architect's role is governance, and I think the architect should champion against governance. The architect's role is to mentor, to harvest, to develop, and to teach. And that feeds into architecture. Finally, I wanted to tell you a little story about controlling a bird virus. I'll probably go into a lot more detail about this in some other cast. But we dealt with an epidemic at home this year. We had 12 different bird feeders. I have 4 tube feeders. Those are seed feeders that are particularly attractive to different types of finches. In late December, we started seeing sick finches hanging out on the feeder. They were just hanging there. They weren't moving around. And as we looked closer, they were getting red boils on their faces. We even found a dead finch. What we were realizing then is that there was a disease breaking out, and it was spreading. And we did our homework to figure out what this disease was. It was likely some sort of bird pox. There's no way to know for sure. They're not wearing a sign that says bird pox or coronavirus. You can just see the evidence and see what's happening there. And so we're like, what do we do? How do we prevent the spread? And so many sites said you have to take down all your bird feeders, sterilize them, leave them away for 6 weeks so that no trace of the virus is around. And I wasn't ready to do that. I didn't want to lose my goldfinches. I have a tattoo of a goldfinch on my arm. I didn't want to lose my woodpeckers. I didn't want to lose my flickers. And I knew that they weren't hitting that seed feeder. The goldfinches were, but the goldfinches didn't seem susceptible to the disease. So what we did was thinking about knowing how the disease transmits, what species are susceptible to it, seeing that it has been transmitting through the seed feeders. We took down the seed feeders. We bleached them. We left them down for a week to keep the house finches from coming back and spreading the virus. So that was a painful week, but we left up the black thistle seed feeders and the suet feeders because, again, in the middle of winter, I wasn't willing to compromise the health of my goldfinches and the health of my woodpeckers for a disease that may or may not even reach them. A week later, we put the 2 seed feeders back up. We started slow. We put one up, then another, then another. Soon the house finches started coming back. They looked so healthy and beautiful. We observed every one of them very closely to make sure there were no signs of disease. And guess what? There never was. We cured the disease. We stemmed the outbreak by following some immediate steps. When we first saw evidence of it, we cleaned up our surfaces, but we made it targeted, and we didn't devastate the other bird populations. And when you're thinking about how to approach the situations happening in the world right now, think about it that way. Think about specifically what's going on and how do you specifically solve that problem without causing devastating, potentially unreparable effects to other populations. Architecture will help you get there. Follow along with me. I'm going to take you down this journey. We're going to keep learning how to think architecturally, do roadmaps, how to deliver on a vision, and how to help people lift their heads from the current chaos to see into the future. I'm Michael Van Cleek, also known as DJ MVK, and I thank you so much for joining me today.